Hi, and welcome to CMO Journeys. I'm Christian Benak, and on this show, I talk with the marketing leaders behind some of today's most interesting brands. We get into their career paths, how they think about marketing, and how they work with agencies. IMO Health sits at the center of healthcare data enablement, helping improve the quality and integrity of clinical data used across hospitals, providers, payers, and the broader healthcare ecosystem. Today's guest is Michael Klozotsky, Chief Marketing Officer at IMO Health. Michael took a highly unconventional path to the CMO suite, from academia and teaching to bartending to leading marketing teams inside complex healthcare and enterprise technology organizations. Michael, welcome to CMO Journeys.
Thank you, Christian. I appreciate you hosting me today.
Absolutely. So this is CMO Journeys, and I love to talk about your journey, and what better way to start than from the beginning. So I would love to know, if somebody had met you when you were, say, 18 years old, would they have predicted that you would end up talking to me right now as the CMO of IMO Health?
Not a chance in heck. Like, there is no way that when I was 18, candidly 28, maybe even 38, that we would have been having this conversation. Part of what I love about what you're doing with this podcast is thinking about people who come to spaces from unconventional ways. And I don't think I'm special in that regard, but my journey is clearly not conventional in any way. I often joke with folks that, candidly, I have no business having the job I have, but I am fortunate and lucky to have the job that I have. So, I come from a background that's a little bit weird, and I hope we can talk about that because weird is good.
Yeah, I love to talk about that. I guess we can go in a few different directions, but I know you spent about a decade teaching English and accountancy at the University of Illinois before eventually then transitioning into marketing and business. What was that pivot like? Talk to me about that.
Yeah, sure. So thank you. So look, my what I imagined was my vocational background, like my true calling in life was to be a teacher. Like that's what I come from a family of teachers. Truly, like I come from a family of teachers. And so this was really my plan for a long time. Interestingly enough, my undergraduate advisor, who was a guy who had kind of an old school approach to thinking about the world of work and what that looked like, always used to joke with me at the end of my academic undergraduate career by saying, "Yeah, Michael, it's great that you're an English major. Like, what are you going to eventually do to make money?" And so as I think about that now and where I sit today, in some weird ways, he was right, right? Like my humanities background, which truly was what, like I said, I thought I was going to do, prepared me in a lot of ways to think outside the box. But the reality in part for me became that, look, I'm going to be real honest. Like, again, I love teaching. The world of academics and the humanities is one that has two pathways. One, it is a pathway that is changing as education changes. And secondly, it was an economic decision for me. Like part of the work that I was doing based on having a bunch of student loans and whatever else was like, is this really the path that makes sense? That said, I think that the kinds of things that teaching taught me are ultimately things that I get to do every day as a CMO, right? As you move, I think, from being a marketing operator on an everyday, like you're writing emails, and I still do some of that stuff, but that work as you move up the chain in terms of what your responsibilities are, ultimately is less about what I do every day, and meaning what I do from a marketing perspective, but is more about like, how do I empower the people who are on my team? How do I make sure that I am consistently removing roadblocks for them? How am I consistently teaching them various things out of my own experience? And again, I think that academic background for me, even though it was not the career that I ultimately chose, was a really important set of skills that ultimately I think allows me to empower my team to do the great work that they do every day.
Yeah, that's interesting. Can you give us an example of where that may have come to life recently?
Yeah. So look, I work in healthcare marketing. We do direct B2B kinds of sales, and those sales have to be ultimately focused on what we are delivering to the customer. So everything in my background is really focused in many ways on like, what is the outcome that you're trying to achieve? And I think that as the world of marketing has changed very rapidly, I mean, especially in the last handful of years, right? Given certain kinds of disruptions with COVID, certain kinds of disruptions in terms of what's happening with AI and technology stacks, I think, look, one of the things that I often talk about is if you're a CMO or you're looking to move up into management roles in terms of marketing, the biggest function that you have to do is think about how you build your team. And so one of the things I often think about is the notion that like marketing changes all of the time. And so how you teach people how to solve complex problems is really ultimately the way that you succeed, right? And so there are lots of different ways you can deal with outbound emails, you can deal with all the analytics that you're doing. But really what you're trying to do is get people to think about what are the real pain points that your customers are trying to deal with, and that all comes back to education for me, right? It comes back to like how you think about creative ways to do the work, how you think about the ways in which you can pivot. Like those are complex human thinking processes, and I think we sometimes dial in a little too tightly on like marketing tactics instead of pulling that up a level and saying like, wait, what's the real problem we're trying to solve? And that for me involves interpretation. It like I said, involves education. And I really think that that's a you can I always say, for example, like, one of the fundamental skills that I think is changing today is how we teach people to write, right? How do you communicate effectively to people? And that's the kind of thing that I don't know that you can have out of the box, right? Like I can show people how to use various kinds of marketing tools. But showing is different than teaching. And teaching is ultimately about to say, if you have a decision point, right? You could go this way or you can go this way. That involves complex kind of discussions among people that I think is really about, let's think about those outcomes and think about what kinds of choices we make. Those are really, without getting grandiose, they're intellectual discussions. And that's where I think human contact is really important.
Yeah. So academia is not your only profession that you've had. I know when we spoke before, you mentioned about bartending and how much that taught you about people, psychology, customer behavior. What are some maybe parallels between running a bar and running a modern marketing organization?
Yeah, that's a great question. Again, as I think about the difference between vocation and occupation, right? Vocation is what is your real calling? Occupation is what do you have to do to pay the bills every day? And for me, again, as a person who spent a long time in academia, like paying the bills is important. And so, literally, from the time I was, I think, 18 years old, well through my graduate school career, I bartended on the side. Now, let me give you the context. I bartended in places that would be typically the kind of thing you'd call a bar and grill or a pub and grub kind of place, right? So you've got an open kitchen, you've got somebody like me behind the bar, you've got line cooks who are doing their work, and I'm mentioning these people importantly for a reason. You've got servers who are out meeting with the customers who are in the restaurant. And then you got a whole bunch of support staff, right? Dishwashers, bussers, all those kinds of folks. The thing I think people the thing I think people sometimes miss, right? That one of the sort of gloss statements that people will say about the importance of working in the service industry is you have to understand customers. I think this is true. But what's a little more in depth there, what's a layer of nuance is that those customers are different. So let's talk about line cooks for a second, right? They ultimately are about getting the product out, right? Getting it out onto a table. They're ultimately, however, accountable to the servers, right? An internal customer and their managers, because at the end of the day, if the food is yucky, the management's going to hear about that in the restaurant. Servers are directly responsible to customers. Think about what's outside again, if we use a marketing analogy, what's outside your company. And then those service people, right? The bussers, the dishwashers, those kinds of folks, they're actually serving everybody else. This is the complexity of the CMO role, which is that I think the shift from being an individual marketing contributor to being a person who is a CMO is about understanding all of those customer stakeholders. Because yes, you have to keep the people who are buying from you happy, but man, you have to keep your CEO happy. You have to keep your chief financial officer happy. You have to keep your sales department, who is knocking at your door every day, happy. And so I think as a bartender, one of the things I learned is And again, part of the difference between a server and a bartender, and I love servers, but servers ultimately deliver things, right? They're kind of implementation people. Bartenders, in part, have to make things and also have to direct traffic. And so I think people sometimes go into marketing, and as they think about their careers, if they're doing that in the right way, they're very focused on the buyer customer, and that's really important. But the job in so many ways is focused on how you keep all of those customer stakeholders happy, right? Your CFO is going to be saying, I want sales sooner and faster. Your sales organization is going to say, I need you to deliver stuff to me all the time, nonstop. Let me get this out into the world. And your job as a CMO is ultimately to say, how do I serve all of those constituencies with the right kind of strategies to keep all of those trains running on time? And for me, candidly, like bartending was no better experience. Again, I'm a person who doesn't have formal academic marketing training. I kind of came out of the job and figured out how to do this. But I will tell you that my work in the service industry is probably the most powerful thing that has impacted the way that I understand my role as a CMO and how you try to keep all those stakeholders happy at one time.
Yeah, I love that story and that analogy. I come from, my first business was a concert promotions business. So not quite bartending, but we definitely, we're dealing with bartenders. And I still say today, I've been through this movie before. It's different characters that are in it, but there's a lot of parallels to that industry and even what I do, today. Curious, you mentioned just now that you really have no business training, no marketing training. When did you first realize that this unconventional background was actually an advantage versus maybe a weakness?
Yeah. So, like I said, I think many of us deal with, conventionally what we talk about as imposter syndrome. And for some of it, for me, it was a pragmatic decision, right? I mean, it truly was pragmatic, which is the world of academics for me was candidly changing in ways that were about publication versus teaching. And that really wasn't what I was interested in. I think that, again, my service industry experience sort of made me say, like, wait, there are different ways to think about the world of business. And I think, and again, as we discussed early in this conversation, I go back to that mentor I had as an undergraduate who said, like, yeah, Michael, you can have all these lofty academic intellectual kinds of goals, but where does the rubber meet the road? And for me, like, as I moved into marketing, and again, I was fortunate. Let me talk for a second about how my own journey changed based on the size of the company that I was in. So again, when I left academics, I decided to go to a really small financial services company. It was about 20 people. That company split into a tinier one, and so at some point I was going from a 25-person company to a 10-person company. That was great, except that I ultimately outgrew what was that sort of environment and then eventually moved into what was a much bigger company, like about 10,000 people. Liked that, got recruited into a company that was 1,000, got acquired by a company that was eventually owned by IBM and 355,000. And finally, I've settled today into a role in a company of 365 people. I have been in this role as a CMO for 7 years, which I am incredibly blessed to be in. The average tenure of a CMO is 2.5 years. So trust me, I'm grateful every day that I do that. But I think that some of what led me back to your specific question about how did I know that the kind of background that I came from was going to sort of work in this environment was really about finding that fit, right? Like what what sorts of structures inside companies were valuable to me? Where could I make the most kind of impact? And as I drew on that experience, as we've discussed in sort of unconventional ways, I think that finding your sweet spot is really important based on your own experience. And for me, a company of the size of IMO Health is really a sweet spot for me.
Yeah, that's great. I'd love to shift gears a bit. We've talked a lot about your past. I'd love to talk about the work you're doing now. Like you said, you've been there for over 7 years, and CMO tenure is much less than that. I've heard even 18, months in some
Sure.
other research. In IMO Health in particular, you guys are operating in a really complex part of healthcare. There's clinical terminology, documentation integrity, data quality. How are you making a very highly technical category emotionally and commercially relevant to buyers?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, look, one of the things we do inside IMO Health, and this is led by our CEO, is we do an exercise every year at the company level called the one word exercise. Interestingly, this came from my CEO's one of her kids, because her kids did this in school. And so every year as an organization, we pick one word, and that becomes our watchword for the year. We also all do this as departments and individuals. So at IMO Health this year, our word is simplify. That's our corporate word this year. And it could not be a more appropriate word for exactly the context you just set out, Christian, right? Look, IMO Health came from a background of software where we were embedded in the electronic health record. So if you think about for everyday users here to make that make sense to you, when you go to your doctor, your primary care doctor, they are likely typing in the electronic health record the entire time they're talking to you. And our background is that we built the dictionaries really inside that. But the company has gone through a really radical transformation in the last couple of years, where not only have we expanded out beyond what was that traditional electronic health record market, but we are now enabling health tech companies that candidly look a lot like ours who sell into those same environments. And we are working in the life sciences industry, which is a brand new space for us, right? So think clinical trials, think about patient finding, like all of these sorts of things. So part of the challenge for me as a marketer is twofold. One, it's my business is already pretty complex, right? Like when I talk to an Uber driver who inevitably says like, "What do you do?" and I can pretty much say like, "Yeah, we build the dictionaries inside the EHR." You can't really see that, right? Like that's the kind of thing where people are like, "I kind of conceptually get this, but I don't really get exactly what you're doing." But as we have moved out, so we've worked hard to be able to explain that. But as we've moved into some of these other market segments in healthcare, the levels of complexity, as you intimated, get more and more. The threshold for being able to explain those things gets higher and higher. And so part of what my team has to do every day is to say, you have to continuously talk about the benefit that you're providing to people, right? You have to make that immediately graspable to people. And part of this philosophy for us around, and this is actually this is a gift for my marketing team today. Part of what my CEO is focused on, in particular this year, is how do we go from being a company who tells everyone about what we do to being a company that can show what we do. And when you work in SaaS spaces, that can be tricky, right? Like that's the kind of thing where it's like, how do you make people make sense of how you normalize data? How do you help people make sense of what it means when a patient has a clean problem list when they're going to talk to their provider? So, like, those are the kinds of things that are real challenges in my business. But part of what I love about the work that my team, my company, and I do every day is if we can boil that down to things that people can easily grasp, that's the sort of stuff that matters, right? Like that's really what matters. And I love that challenge every day. In a world, again, whether you do B2C marketing, whether you do B2B marketing, whether you work in healthcare or consumer finance or wherever you work, like at the end of the day, you have to get people to understand the value of what you are giving them, or no one cares about buying. And so I think that this kind of philosophical approach to simplification is a really, really key lesson, not only for what we are doing at IMO Health, but candidly, I truly would give this advice to every marketer out in the world, which is the world of business is increasingly complex. Your job is to make that simple. And if you make that simple, you can get people to buy.
Yeah, I love the quote that it's sometimes hard to see the label when you're inside of the jar. And uh, I'm curious, given what you just said, where do you find yourself needing outside perspective, even though you have such a strong, internal team?
Yeah, that's great. And again, I am perfect question. I am truly fortunate in that when I came to IMO Health, we didn't have a formalized marketing function really before I got here. So part of the joy of me coming to this role was a CEO who said to me, like, Michael, I need you to build this from the ground up. So one of the things that I often think about, and again, I'm fortunate, but one of the things I think about, and in the age of AI, this is probably a little bit contrarian of a position, but I think people first and then tech stack. Why I say that is because I read an interesting article today, and I'm sorry I don't remember who wrote it, so I can't give credit, but they talked about the difference between complicated and complex. And here's what I loved about that. Complicated means that when you think about where you're trying to get to, you can kind of identify what's at the beginning, but you're likely going to get to a single outcome, right? So if you think about what's the appropriate way to push marketing messaging out in the market, at the end of the day, that tactic is probably only going to have one path or maybe two. When you think about the complex, the difference is the complex, I think, ultimately has multiple potential pathways and outcomes. And so that requires real human intervention and thinking. And I think that that's a good that's a good sort of distinction for why you need people. That said, again, I'll go back to the circumstances of my particular business. We we have used agency support in various ways over time. Again, I'm fortunate to have a big team, but my team still doesn't have certain kinds of reach that agencies can use. And I'll give you the example from 2026 for us. As I said earlier, we were formerly largely selling only into hospitals. We're well known there. We are deeply entrenched, deeply, deeply entrenched. Life sciences, there are a handful of folks. Candidly, I would argue there are a whole bunch of folks who don't know us from Adam. In the health tech space, we are selling to companies, as I said before, that look a lot like us. And so there's a weird kind of middle ground there where part of what you have to do is get people to understand candidly just who you are. So we elected this year to seek some agency support in a what would traditionally be called public relations, right? PR. Look, today with the tools you have available, almost anybody can write an effective press release. You can do this. Like there are tools that will help you do this even if you don't have that skill. But what you can't do, what I can't do on my own, is I do not anymore have relationships with 10 different kinds of reporters who are in the health tech space, or 50 different companies or trade shows or podcasters who are in the life sciences space. That is work that my team cannot do on its own. So we made the decision earlier this year to say, you know what? We don't really need old school traditional PR, but what we do need is someone to help us find those relationships. What we do need is someone who can say to me, because sure, I've got a team who can do desk research, but if these are folks who have relationships with multiple different, again, let's say podcasters or opportunities to speak on subject matter expert webinars, that's the kind of work that that sort of reach has that I can't possibly own in house. It's just, A, it's way too expensive. And B, it is simply something that is not necessarily always on. And so, what I love about those agency relationships is that when you find the right agency, especially one who is specialized in the field that you work in, and that's a piece of advice that I would give to folks, is one of the challenges given ever increasing tightness around budgets and what your CFO as a marketer is going to allow you to spend. You got to pick your agencies based on where their sweet spots are. Look, there are a lot of really smart people who can go 5 miles wide and 1 inch deep. We don't make that decision for this reason alone, because think about how discovery has to work in those conversations. If you want to set up a 3 month project or a 6 month project with an agency, if they have to spend 2 months just getting up to speed on your business, man, I get it. It's important, but that is a whole lot of sunk cost that ultimately doesn't get you out into the market faster. And so I've been really, really fortunate. And again, the agency we're using today in this regard has been super helpful because basically their discovery period was a week. We sent them a whole bunch of background stuff. Like we got them to drink from the fire hose, but at the end of, and we've done a couple of discovery calls, but at the end of the day, they came to us already with experience in health tech and life science, and that's where I needed them to be experienced. And so when I think about the work that we're doing together, rather than spending a month and a half like playing the dating game, let's get to know you, these folks were able to hit the ground running. And so again, today, what I would tell people, if you are a CMO or a marketing leader and you are thinking about agency support, one of the first criteria I think you should think about establishing is like, do these people understand the markets we're serving? Do they roughly understand the vocabulary that we're using every day? Because that's where you get to back to what we talked about earlier, Christian, right? Back to simplification, back to making meaning happen in the market. That comes from ultimately finding an agency partner who really is a fit for you. I think the days of just like generic agency marketing are candidly limited today.
Yeah, that's refreshing because that's what we are advising a lot of our clients on. So it's great to hear that. You mentioned AI and how anybody can kind of spin up a press release now, but in this case, the relationships were important. I'm curious, do you foresee other marketing capabilities that are becoming maybe too specialized or too complex that to build in-house, and maybe because of AI or other reasons?
Yeah, for sure. Look, I think that one of the, and again, if you read marketing industry trade publications, if you read the kinds of conversations, let's say, that are happening on LinkedIn today, one of the things I think is happening as companies, and candidly, I think this is a mistake. I think there's going to be a correction in the market. I think it's going to take a while. So I'll come back to that in a second. But one of the things I think is happening is that, look, there was a time period, I would say 6 to 10 years ago, and I'll use this role as an example, where the number of people out there who were claiming to be SEO gurus, like there were, you couldn't, you could, you could swing a hammer and you could find 20 people who said, in any given day, who said they were an SEO guru. By the way, no one says that anymore because the technology and the tools have sort of caught up to this. I think the opposite has happened to some extent in the contemporary marketing landscape, which is we indexed away from what was that hyper specialization from roles. But as companies have tried to save cost, they've started to do things like say, I want a CMO or I want a marketing leader. And then when you dig into what that job description is, they want someone who understands SEO and AEO. They want someone who understands lead and demand generation. They want someone who can do marketing analytics. They might want somebody who can do RevOps, even, to think about that. Wait, now we also need that person to, like, all of these kinds of roles, as marketing teams get smaller, as technology improves, and as budgets start to shrink, we start to put all of this pressure on building like a 5-person marketing team, and we expect that they can do all of those things. I got to tell you flat out, the answer to that question is that's a myth. Like, that is simply not true, which is why part of what I said to you earlier is, as I've thought about my own team, and even as marketing is evolving, if you start with people and get the foundation right, then what you can do is you can take your agency strategy to supplement that in various ways, your technology stack strategy to implement or to augment that in various ways. But now I'm back to this whole complicated versus complex. Of course, it's complicated. Tools can help you make it less complicated, but they can't solve for what are really those complex problems. And so I think that part of where we are going today is going to radically change the world of marketing. Look, I don't know how. I have two what I would call pure content players on my team. They are tremendously smart. But candidly, if I were to go to my CFO today and say, hey, I want to hire another writer, I just want to hire a writer, he would tell me, Michael, you're crazy. Like, there are tools that can do this for you. I recognize that that's a real risk. So if you're an individual contributor in marketing and you're a content person, what I would tell you today is you need to lean into AI. You need to learn and lean into contemporary marketing stack, not because you still can't be effective as a writer or as a content producer or a content marketer, but because you have to find that balance between what are the tools you can use to make your brain more effective, not to make all the output more effective. Another way to think about this is there's been, I think, a lot of smart commentary saying, like, where we are today, if you think about, again, marketing content, distribution is something that there are massive efficiencies to be gained by using technology tools. Ideation is still something that I believe requires human intervention, unless you want your stuff to be labeled as AI slop. And even I, as someone who came from a content background, bristles a little bit when I hear everybody calling an M dash AI slop. Like, that's nonsense. That's not true. Like, we used to write M dashes. If I was trained in English, we used to write M dashes long before AI was here. But that content is starting to kind of all look the same when you are entirely pushing that through a machine. And so I think the companies that are ultimately going to come out on the other side of this in the best possible way, and the marketing professionals that are going to come out in the best possible way, recognize that human technology connection, that recognize their own limitations either as an individual contributor or as a team, and then again rely on agencies to do the work that they can't scale on their own, and rely on technology to do the things that human beings don't do well. If you find that triangle and you identify it properly within the shifting spaces of your business between human ideation, agency support for where you can't fund everything or support everything on your own, and then technology that can help amplify that work, I think that's a winning solution.
Yeah. Such an interesting time. I love that perspective that you provided there. So we're trying to write things down here a bit, and I know a word that's come up a few times in our prior conversation and then today is the word weird. In
Yeah.
describing both yourself and some of the people that you value professionally. I got a question that I'm curious about. Do you think companies accidentally hire too many people who just think the same way?
Absolutely. The biggest hiring mistake I think people make is that they align that to, this is going to sound perhaps really controversial. I could be wrong too. I'm willing to admit that. But I think companies sometimes think about what are the business objectives that we need to get to. And so we look literally for just a role instead of looking for a human being in a role. And that's where weird comes in, which is to say, look, I work with, and I'm not even talking about marketing, right? Like, my CEO doesn't have an MBA, and she's leading a massive and transformational company. I love that about her. I have marketers on my team who have, some of them have marketing training, some of them have healthcare backgrounds. All of them have the right kinds of ways to think about the world and to think about the world of business. And so I think that the danger that companies walk into, especially today, is who can just do the job versus who can actually think inside the job. And thinking is really critical. And thinking is where weirdness comes out, right? Thinking is where people who ultimately might come at an idea in a way that is not simply based on, I'm writing code, I'm writing emails, I'm building products, I'm developing pricing, to what if we thought about pricing in entirely different ways, right? What if we're B2B and we use a model that is completely consumer facing? What would that do to our business? The point is, you might not want to go there, but man, you better ask that question. And if you don't hire people who can ask those kinds of questions, who can literally say, we are at a fork in the road and I could go right or left. I want the person who doesn't just say I can go right or left. What happens if we turn around and go backwards and start this over? What happens if we go down this path, but we know that we're immediately going to make a U turn? Those are the kinds of things that if you are just hiring for a role or a job description, you're never going to get people who are going to say left or right, actually, maybe backwards, or left or right, let's make a U turn. That's the kind of thing that I will advocate for weird all day long. And weird is going to get you to answers that you didn't even expect. And I think that's the difference. The difference is not, we have two potential pathways. What happens if we do A or B? The question is, what happens if we do neither? What happens if we do A and then do B? What happens if we do both at one time? Like, all of those questions are questions that people who ultimately think outside the box will absolutely transform your company. If you are hiring for a role, you're ultimately going to prescribe what your outcome is from the jump. And guess what? Sometimes, maybe a lot of the time, you're going to be wrong. And so if you have people there who can think outside of conventional methods, you've got a winning scenario. I firmly believe this all day long.
Yeah, I would back that. And I think especially now with AI, with people just kind of turning, I mean, AI is going to give you the vanilla answers, then everybody's going to have the same answers. You need people that are able to think outside of the box. I think moving forward, it's going to be a skill that's even more valuable to companies than, really ever before.
Agreed. Totally agreed.
This was wonderful, Michael. I want to thank you for all the great insights, sharing your weird journey through today, and all the success you've had at IMO Health. So again, thanks again for the conversation. To everybody watching, don't forget to follow CMO Journeys for more conversations with the marketing leaders that are shaping what's next. I'm Christian Madak. Thanks for tuning in. We'll see you in the next episode.